Good morning, everyone. We're going to start the talk on educational deprivation among scheduled tribes in Eastern India. And this talk will be delivered by Dr. John Kujur. Dr. John Kujur is now the project scientist one, currently working at the DST Center for Policy Research at NISER. And as you must be aware that this DST Center for Policy Research has basically two broad objectives. One is to work on energy transition related issues in Eastern India. And the second one is tribal education in Eastern India. And we have already organized 4 lectures on energy transition related issues. And today we are going to discuss education deprivation among the scheduled tribes in Eastern India. So, to give a brief introduction of the speaker, Dr. John Kujur is an alumnus of Center for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram, and under JNU, Jawaharlal University. Before this, before joining at NISER, Dr. Kujur was working at Center for Budget, Governance and Accountability in Bangalore, right? And budget and fiscal policy studies. Fiscal policy studies. Okay. So with this brief note, I invite Dr. John Kujur to start his lecture. And so, in fact, the whole objective of this lecture is basically to have more discussion on this paper, because this is what we are working on, and we got some interesting finding, and Dr. John will be presenting on that, and then we'll have discussion. So I expect all of you to participate in discussion and share your feedback so that this can be revised and good policy paper can be produced. Over to you, Dr. John.
Thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity. The topic I'm going to speak on is educational deprivation among scheduled tribes in Eastern India. And this is not a new topic. Numerous research have been done on this issue, that is tribal education. But we believe that the more we discuss, more insights we get. So before going into analysis, I will briefly touch upon the discourse on. Sorry? Okay. I will briefly touch upon the discourse on tribal society in India. Now, when we think of tribal community or indigenous people, we usually picturize a group of semi-naked people doing Thingala dance, and that's how our film industry, that is whether it is Bollywood or Hollywood or even our Hollywood, shows us. And in fact, this picturization or visualization is that represents our thought. That is, how do we look at the tribal? That is, we basically consider them as primitive, we consider them as barbarian, we consider them as uncivilized. And in fact, this picturization or visualization, this is of the colonial construction and also construction of the dominant ideology that believes in social hierarchy. Now, these are the characteristics that is followed when any community is recognized as scheduled tribe, that are primitiveness, geographically isolated, shy of contact with community at large, and educationally and economically backward. Now, if we look at all these criteria, then we find that these are of the so-called mainstream construction of tribal identity. That is, this is the definition that the so-called mainstream society give about the tribal society. That is, tribal are primitive, they want to live in isolation, and they don't want to be part of development process. Now, if we see the history of tribal history, in reality we found a different picture. From various literature and various studies, we find that tribals once lived in the plain lands, and they were also settled cultivators, and they had also well-established kingdoms. Like, for example, we had Gondwana kingdoms, and we had also kingdoms of Bhil and kingdoms of Munda in the central Indian states. And over the time, the invaders crept into the tribal land, and tribals fled deeper into the forest, the areas which were not reachable to the dominant community. Now, basically, there were two reasons why they fled deeper into the forest. First is they did not want to be the slaves or the agriculture laborer of the dominant community, and second, they refused to be assimilated into the dominant socio-cultural structure. Now, as I mentioned, they played deeper into the forest. Here we see currently of the 257 scheduled tribe districts, 230 are either forested or hilly. That is, most of the tribal people live in the forest or hilly areas. Now, again, if we see the history of tribal, then we find that education had been or has been very much part of tribal social life. Here, most of us might not be knowing about this word, that is Dhumkuria. Actually, this Dhumkuria is a youth dormitory, and in modern language we call it school. This Dhumkuria is a Kuruk tongue that is spoken by Oram tribe, and this youth dormitory is called Gitiora among Munda. And in other tribal communities also, this youth dormitory is existing. Now, particularly the youths who turns 10 to 11 years of old, they become the members of this Dhumkuria, and their membership continues until their marriage. Now, in this Dhumkuria, they are taught about the livelihood skills. They are taught about the societal norms, laws, and culture, and they are also trained to be the leaders of the tribal society. And even they are taught about the societal values like life of reciprocity. That is, they are trained to be the volunteers in the societal functions in the tribal society. Now, unfortunately, what we find today is that most of these Dhamkuriyas are vanishing gradually. But one good news has come from the government of state of Jharkhand, that the government of Jharkhand has already taken initiatives to revive this Dhamkuriya system in the tribal land. Now, if we see the development process, now from the history of tribals, what we find is that tribals were never against the development or the civilization process, but they were against the process of development that is being followed across the world and in India particularly. For example, if you see the development process in India that is being followed is based on basically the principle that is someone has to bear the cost of development. And this development process has literally devastated the tribal society in the three ways. First is the large scale displacement among the tribals, and one of them, a renowned scholar named Walter Fernandez, who has done extensive research on this on the development induced displacement, shows in his study that till now, more than 50 million people have been displaced in India because of various projects, and out of them, 40% belongs to tribal community. Now we know what happens to tribal people after displacement. That is, they lost their land, they lost their livelihood, and they lost their social cultural life. Now, even I had also conducted one case study in Raurkela on the displaced population of on the displaced tribal population in Raurkela. That is, and I had tried to look at the long-term impact of displacement on them. And the displacement had happened in 1950s due to the Raurkela steel plant project. And I had tried to look at what happened to them after 6 decades of displacement. And I found that till now, most of the displaced tribals are facing many kinds of impoverishment risks, like homelessness, joblessness, economic, social disarticulation, and marginalization, etc. And the second aspect that has marginalized tribals in the process of development is the extension of modern governance structure in the tribal land. Actually, this extension of tribal land, modern governance structure to the tribal land has facilitated the migration of the non-tribals who have over the time captured the tribal lands, and as a result, the land alienation among them has increased. And on the other hand, this modern governance structure in the tribal land or in remote areas has been characterized by large-scale corruption and frequent transfer of officials, and also diversion of funds that is allocated for the tribal development to other purposes. Now, the another aspect that we find that has marginalized tribals in the process of development is paternalism of outsiders. Now, this paternalism of outsider means the most of the tribal development policies are being framed by the dominant communities which represents their own interest. For example, if you see, soon after the independence, most of the states in India enacted land laws to protect the tribal rights. But within 3-4 years, they amended their land laws to ease the land acquisition process, and that represents the interest of the dominant socioeconomic structure. Now, 3 days back, our Odisha government proposed to amend one land laws, that is Odisha Regulation number 2 of 1956, that actually protects Adivasis from land alienation. And the land basically, that laws basically restricts the transfer of immovable property of the tribal to the non-tribals. But now, if it is amended, then there will not be any restriction. And we know that from the history, what happens to them when there is no check on the land transfer. That is the land in near future, there will be escalation in the land alienation among the tribals. Currently, when we locate the tribal, when we see their geographical location, then we find that Adivasis are now at the end of the territory of forest area, and now the non-tribals are migrating to the tribal area with a very vast space. Now the tribals have been left with only two options: either get exploited and or compete with them in the process of development. Now here we realize the importance of education among the tribal population. That is, when this education, as we consider education as one of the important indicator of development, and through this education, tribal will be able to protect themselves from the exploitation of outsider, and also they can protect their society and culture. So here we have analyzed the progress of education among the scheduled tribes over the period of time. Now here we can see that in 1951, soon after independence, the literacy rate among the tribal population was only 3%, while the overall literacy was 18%. And this gap was because during the colonial period, the British government was reluctant to invest on tribal education, because the cost of education in the remote area was very high, and the British government also failed to recruit the committed teachers who are sensitive towards the tribal culture and tribal society. Now, over the time, we find that the tribal literacy rate has increased along with the overall literacy rate. But if you see the trend until 1981, the gap between overall literacy and tribal literacy rate has been widened. In 1981, we find the tribal literacy rate is 16%, while the overall literacy rate is 44%, and there is 28 percentage point difference. And it is because during this period, the investment expenditure on the school infrastructure, particularly in remote areas, was very less. In the past 5-year plan, only 4,000 schools were open in the tribal areas, but these 4,000 schools were not sufficient for a vast tribal population in the country. Now, we also have our commission that reports that due to the lack of school infrastructure, there are problems of absenteeism, stagnation, and dropout among the tribals. And again, the education survey also talks about lack of access to school that has led to the high dropouts among the tribal children. Now, after 1981, we find that the growth of literacy among the tribal has increased, and it is because we find during in the fifth 5-year plan, that is 1974 to 78, the tribal sub-plan was launched, and separate fund was allocated for the tribal development and so for the school infrastructure. And therefore, we find the literacy rate of tribal has increased at a faster pace.
I have a quick question. So the hypothesis that education will help them from exploitation, is that the hypothesis?
Yeah, there's no. I'm just trying to build a context. Yeah, that is hypothesis.
So like education will help them not to get exploited.
Yes.
But is there is this something that we want to prove as hypothesis, or does it exist in literature that if you get educated, you will not be exploited? Education is important as such.
Yes.
But will it help from exploitation as such?
Yeah, it will help from absolutely in the sense like when they are getting land alienated and they are mostly becoming the marginal. They are involved in casual labor and all the precarious labor, and from this perspective, they are getting exploited. Now, currently, now most of the tribals are self-independent. They are not dependent on other communities, but when they will lose their land, and if they don't have any other means of livelihood, then they will get exploited. But if they get good education and they are engaged in better occupation, then definitely they will not be their exploitation will be less on them. So
exploitation on the land also will continue because they can just move out of tribal areas to cities where they will get better opportunities.
Yes.
Based on education. But they will still get alienated out of their own land.
Yes.
The way it will just not be called an exploitation because it's a so motor choice. But alienation will still happen because somebody gets educated, they move out of their land, gets alienated from the tribal area. The reason because of that change is basically if you look at cyber crimes currently, the largest people who fall into that category is the IT people.
Yes.
And they're, if we consider them educated, they are educated. But they are the most exploited in cyberspace.
Okay. And there is also another dimension to it. If we see,
this is a very bigger question. We'll keep at the end.
Yes.
Let us finish this presentation because this has a lot of loaded.
Here in this project, basically we are analyzing the educational progress among the scheduled tribe in the 5 Indian states. Those are Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, and West Bengal. And here we can see that of these 5 states, the state of Odisha, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh have the high concentration of the scheduled tribe population. That is, in Odisha, the scheduled tribe population constitute 23% of the total population. In Jharkhand, they constitute 26%, and in Chhattisgarh, they constitute 31%. And if we see in terms of progress in their education, then we find that of these 3 major states, Odisha has performed worse, while Chhattisgarh has performed better. Here we can see that the tribal literacy in Chhattisgarh is 59%, that is equal to the overall tribal literacy rate in India, and while in Odisha, it is just 52%. And we find here gender gap in both the states. Like in Odisha, the gender gap is 22.5 percentage point, and here Chhattisgarh 21 percentage point. But here in this presentation, mostly I will be focusing on overall educational progress and the gender gap, gender dimension. We are also explaining that, but that is not part of this presentation. So we are still doing analysis on it, and because we found that in terms of gender, women, although their literacy rate is low, but their performance in terms of dropout, in terms of gross enrollment ratio, and transition rate, their performance is better than male members. So we are still analyzing that one, and we will be presenting that in another talk. So, in order to understand the disparities between these 2 states and also the factor that affects tribal education, we also went through the various kind of literature that is, and we came across various kind of factors that determine the tribal education. And here we derived the economic factors, socio-cultural factors, demographic factors, school infrastructure. Now, in economic factors, we found the poverty, the prevalence of poverty has been one of the major factors that is leading to dropout among the children, because we know that half the, as per the UN report 2021, half of the tribal population is in multidimensional poverty, and we know that when the household is in poverty, the children are forced to join the labor market to support their family, and eventually they drop out of the school. And again, the direct cost of schooling, particularly in tribal area, is higher. That is, if you see the real cost of schooling, that is miscellaneous cost, like buying notebooks, books, and even transportation costs, that is relatively higher in the tribal areas, and that leads to again dropout among the tribal children. And again, occupation of the parents also determines the educational deprivation, educational progress among the tribal children. That is, we know that most of the tribals are in the precarious occupation, that is, they are marginal farmers and they are involved in forestry. And they mostly need the labor, but mostly they employ the family labor, and the children are the part of the family labor. And when they participate in the economic activities, they discontinue their schooling, and that leads to again dropout. Now, in the social cultural factors, we find the concentration of tribal population that influence the policy making, particularly if you see the education, particularly education policy. For example, if we see in the Northeast India, the concentration of the tribal population is high. So the tribal population dominates politically, and also they also dominate the policy making. And in the school curriculum and also in the education policy, we find the representation of the tribal culture and tribal society and tribal social life, and that incentivize the tribal children to continue their schooling. But in the central Indian states, what we find is that tribal community is minority, and their culture and their social life is represented very less in the school curriculum or educational policy, and that disincentivize mostly the tribal children. And now again, we have conflict between socialization at home and school norms that again create unwillingness towards education among the tribal children. Because we find in the tribal society that students are given much freedom, but in school what happens is that in whole day they are kept within the four wall, and they are taught discipline. So this conflict between the tribal societal norms and school norms that creates unwillingness among the tribal children towards education. And the medium of instruction has been one of the major factor in the tribal education. And we know that the widely spoken language is followed in most of the state as medium of instruction, and that creates the communication gap between the teacher and the tribal children. And eventually that leads to decrease in the willingness among the tribal children towards education. And another factor is the large-scale social discrimination in the classroom from their peers and teachers. And often this is reported from the various studies that when the teachers are mostly from the other non-tribal backgrounds, they use the word backward, uncivilized, savage, barbarian, etc. towards other children, and they also dissuade the tribal children speaking their mother tongue. And this social discrimination leads to dropout among the tribal children. And there are also demographic factors like tribal child marriage that also leads to because many of the tribal communities, they practice child marriage, and eventually the student drop out of the school. And again, the factors like seasonal migration. Now we have tribal livelihood report, tribal livelihood migration report 2021, that shows that a large section of the tribal population is now migrant, and they migrate with their family. And when they migrate, the children have to discontinue the schooling, and again that leads to dropout. And now we have also lack of school infrastructure from the various government reports, we know that. And that is lack of teachers, lack of schools, lack of basic infrastructure that again lead to dropout among the students, tribal students. Now, based on this literature review, we have also framed our objective to analyze the patterns of educational deprivation among the tribals in Odisha and Chhattisgarh, and we have also attempted to scrutinize different factors that are responsible for the disparities between them. And again, we have studied the process of educational deprivation among the tribals. And here we have used unified district information for educational plus data, and we have also used a Census of India and annual status of education report. And we are largely dependent on the UDAS data because this is the most reliable and data and trustable data as per the ministry, because this gives data of 15 lakh schools and data of 95 lakh teachers and 26 crore data of 26 crore children. And this data is verified at three levels: block levels and district level and state level. And here we have used a simple descriptive statistic to draw inferences from the data. And here we have used three concepts in this study: dropout rate, that is percentage of students failing to complete a particular school or college course; And gross enrollment ratio, that is ratio of the total enrollment regardless of age to the population of age group that officially corresponds to the level of education. So, and transition rate, new entrants to the next level of education in a given year expressed as a percentage of number of pupils enrolled in the previous level of education in the previous year. Now, this is our findings. Now, here we can see that at all India level, we find that the dropout rate among the tribal is more than that of the other social groups. Here, we find that the primary dropout among scheduled tribe is 2.83, while the overall dropout rate is 1.45, and the dropout among the scheduled caste is 1.46. And in case of our primary dropout, we can see that the dropout among the scheduled tribe children is 6.03, which is much higher than that of the overall upper primary dropout. And again, secondary dropout rate is also higher for scheduled tribe children, that is, it is 17%, while the overall rate we find it is 13%. And if here mostly we are focusing on Odisha and Chhattisgarh, and here we find that if you see primary dropout and upper primary dropout in both the states, then we don't find much difference. But when we see that secondary dropout, we find there is a big difference. That is, in Odisha, the secondary dropout among the scheduled tribe children is 33%, but in Chhattisgarh it is just 13%. Now, in case of gross enrollment ratio, we also find that the gross enrollment ratio among the tribal is less than the of the overall, particularly when we look at higher secondary education, that is 11th standard, 12th standard. That is, the overall gross enrollment ratio is 57, while for scheduled caste it is 62%, and for scheduled tribe it is 52%. And if we compare the Odisha and Chhattisgarh, then we find that the gross enrollment ratio, particularly in higher secondary education, in Odisha is 39%, while in Chhattisgarh it is 62%. It is nearly twice that of Odisha. So here also Odisha lags behind Chhattisgarh. And again, if you see the transition rate among the different transition rate among the tribals, then we find that if we compare Odisha and Chhattisgarh, we find that the transition rate that is from secondary education to higher secondary education is much higher for Chhattisgarh, while for Odisha it is very less. For Odisha, we find that the transition rate is only 40%, but for Chhattisgarh, we find that the transition rate of scheduled tribe from secondary to higher secondary is twice that of Odisha, that is 84% as well. Now, this is one of the main reason for the disparity existing between Odisha and Chhattisgarh, and we found that both these states have different schooling structure. And in Chhattisgarh, we found that the secondary education and higher secondary education are being imparted in the same school, while in Odisha, these educations are being imparted in the different school. For example, if we see the higher secondary education, that is school that is providing education from standard 1 to standard 12, the number of such school in Chhattisgarh is 1,705, while in Odisha, the number of such school is only 211. And again, if you see the higher secondary school that is providing education from standard 9 to standard 12, we find the number of such school in Chhattisgarh is 2,707, while the number of such school in Odisha is 0. And again, if we take the education school that is providing education from 6th standard to 12th standard, the number of such school in Chhattisgarh is 188, while in Odisha it is 328, but there is no much difference. And same trend we also find in case of residential school. For example, if you take the residential school that is providing one standard education from 1 standard to 12 standard, the number of such school in Chhattisgarh is 148, while in Odisha it is 64. And when we see the schools, that is residential school that is providing education 9th standard to 12th standard, the number of such school is 676 in Chhattisgarh, while in Odisha it is 0. Now I will explain why the change in school, or when the schools are located in a different place, that leads to dropout. I will explain that in the later slides. Now here also we find that in all over India, about 689 Eklavya model residential schools have been sanctioned, and of them 400 one residential Colloquy model residential schools are functional now, and this Colloquy model residential school actually particularly dedicated to tribal children, and this provide education from 6th standard to 12th standard. And here if we see, if you compare Chhattisgarh and Odisha, then we find that Chhattisgarh have been in Chhattisgarh 74 Colloquy model residential school have been sanctioned, and 73 are functional. But in Odisha, the highest number of Colloquy model residential schools have been sanctioned, that is 104, but only 32 are functional. And we inquire about that why less number of schools are functional in Odisha, and we found that this question was raised in the parliament, and the Minister of Tribal Affairs replied to this question, saying that the ministry is still working with the state of Odisha government to acquire land in order to establish this Colloquy model residential school. So the establishment of this Colloquy model residential school in Odisha is very slow. Now here, how dropouts happen when there is been change in school, or when the schools are in a different location. Now, when change in school happen, that is particularly higher secondary education to higher secondary education, the cost of schooling actually increases. That is the cost starting from the application process to the admission process, because that requires a time, and also that during that period the students need to spend money on miscellaneous things like buying books, buying notebooks, dress, and transportation cost, etc. And that eventually dissuades tribal children particularly from joining the higher education. And again, this change in school also leads to increase in the distance of school. And particularly in Odisha, we know that the secondary schools are mostly located in the panchayat areas, but the higher secondary education, that is colleges, are mostly located in the block areas. And we find that the distance from tribal habitat to block is more than that of the panchayat, and eventually that leads to dropout, as this more distance leads to the higher cost, and also high opportunity cost among the tribal children. And again, there has been also lack of college and seats in college. So if we see this table, then we find, and if we add all the secondary education school and higher secondary education school, and if we derive the ratio, then we find that in Odisha there is 4.15 higher secondary school, there is one college. But in Chhattisgarh, for 1.5 schools, there is one college. So in Odisha, there is lack of colleges and also seats in the college. And again, some of the tribals also move to urban area for the higher education, but they mostly encounter a completely different socioeconomic structure or cultural practices there, and often they fail to adapt themselves in the new socioeconomic environment, and eventually they drop out of the colleges. Now, the another reason we found for disparities between Chhattisgarh and Odisha is that here we see that the pupil-teacher ratio in Chhattisgarh is better than that of the Odisha, and here particularly in the higher secondary education. And here we can see that in Chhattisgarh, the average number of children per teacher is 16, while in Odisha it is 35. And again, we have also derived this pupil-teacher ratio for the tribal-dominated districts in both the states, and we find that in Chhattisgarh, the districts which are tribal-dominated, that is the districts which are having more than 50% of the tribal population, there we find that the pupil-teacher ratio is better than even that of the state average. That is, in Chhattisgarh it is 16, but in tribal districts we find that that pupil-teacher ratio is less than 16. But in case of Odisha, we find that the pupil-teacher ratio in the scheduled tribe districts, that is scheduled tribe dominated districts, is worse than that of the even state average. Here, particularly if we see the Kandhamal, here the pupil-teacher ratio is 52, which is much worse than the overall pupil-teacher ratio in Odisha, and even much worse than the Chhattisgarh. And even in other tribal-dominated districts also, we find that pupil-teacher ratio is very high. for example, Malkangiri and Gajapati, etc. Now, again, we also look at the representation of the scheduled tribe teacher in the Indian in the schools in this both state, and we find that the representation of scheduled tribe teacher is very less in Odisha as compared to Chhattisgarh. Now, in Odisha, the scheduled tribe population constitute 23% of the total population, but their representation is only 12% in the school. That is particularly from standard 1 to standard 12. And while in Chhattisgarh, we find that the tribal population constitutes 27% of the 31% of the total population, but they represent 26% of the total teacher in the schools. So what we perceive is that when the representation of the teachers from the marginal community is less in the school, the students from the marginal communities are more likely to face the social discrimination, and that again leads to dropout among them. And again, we try to look at the school infrastructure in the both states, and we found that Odisha lags behind the Chhattisgarh in all aspects of infrastructure. For example, if we see the land availability, then we find that in Chhattisgarh, 81% of the school have their own land, but in Odisha, we find that 75% of the school have their land. And again, if you see the furniture, then we find that in Chhattisgarh, 38% of the school have the furniture, and in Odisha, it is 44%. And if we see the computer availability, then we find that 89% of the schools in Chhattisgarh have computer facility, but in Odisha, only 26% of the school have computer facility. Now, these are our main findings. Now, differences in schooling structure has been the major reason for the disparities in tribal education in two states, and pupil-teacher ratio and low representation of scheduled tribe teacher in the higher secondary school has also have contributed towards the disparity between these two states. And in terms of school infrastructure, Odisha lags behind the Chhattisgarh. And here we suggest that the government of Odisha needs to increase the availability of higher secondary school. And we know that the Odisha government is now merging both secondary education and higher secondary education, but we know that the infrastructure is there is lack of infrastructure, because if we visit the schools in the rural areas, then we will find that the students from multiple classes, they sit together in the one class. So government needs to invest, government need to do heavy expenditure on the school infrastructure. And again, government need to recruit more teachers, particularly the scheduled tribe teacher, to improve the pupil-teacher ratio, particularly in the tribal-dominated districts. And more number of residential schools need to be also established, particularly for higher secondary education. And the both state and central government need to speed up the establishment of Ecology model residential school in the tribal regions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John, for your presentation and really highlighting actually the gaps between Odisha and Chhattisgarh. So, although Odisha and Chhattisgarh, if you see the income level of Odisha and Chhattisgarh, per capita income wise, we're almost equal. Okay, so, but in spite of that, Chhattisgarh is doing much better in tribal education than Odisha. So, and if I just give you the key highlights, like why Chhattisgarh, like our objective was basically try to understand why tribal children in Chhattisgarh do better than tribal children in Odisha. We find probably 3 or 4 reasons. The first one is that the 11th and 12th standard of Chhattisgarh comes or is provided in almost the same school. In Odisha, we have a division, like up to 10th, we have a board of secondary education. Then for 11th and 12th, you have to go to different college, not like CBSE schools. And we have a different board also, in terms of higher secondary education. So that could be one of the barriers. Chhattisgarh is providing continuous education up to 12th in one school, and the number of such schools are higher in Chhattisgarh. That is one important reason we find. And second is that the availability of tribal teachers is also a key factor. If we see actually the percentage of tribal population in Odisha and their representation in the tribal schools, that also is not actually proportionate. And then second, the people teacher ratio in the tribal dominated districts are lower. Like it's higher. That means less teachers are there for more children. So and then infrastructure. So these are the four highlights that we get if we compare between Odisha and Chhattisgarh education and why such differences is arising. So now I think the floor is open for discussion. If you can provide any insights or if you have any other comments that Shubhankar has left. Okay, so
I will see. It's very informative. I want to know a little bit more about this Eklavya Model Residential School. When did it start? Like, because we have Navodaya schools before that, I think, right? So, what was the need for specifically? Because this one would say that this is specifically for tribal children.
Yes, yes.
So this some people may argue that since we already have one model Navodaya, maybe that would be like inclusive. If you have different kinds of different social groups. You have a specific one. Will there, I mean, just
yeah. There was a Devar Commission report, and they found that the literacy rate among the tribal children was very less. And after that, and even we have also one report there, and that study also shows that the education progress among the tribal children was very less. And from that onwards, it was decided that a special school, particularly for the tribal children, will be established in the blocks which have more than 50% of at least 50% of the tribal population, or at least 20,000 tribal population. So it was decided during the 1970s. From that onwards, this Eklavya Model Residential School have been established, but still now large number of model schools have been sanctioned, but very less have been very less are functional now. Particularly in Odisha, as highest number of model residential school have been sanctioned, but out of that there is 104, but out of that only 32 are functional. So now let's see what is the progress in future.
So wherever there are these Eklavya model schools, Navodaya schools also exist.
Navodaya schools.
For example, there is like Malkangiri. So
the vision of Eklavya Model Residential School was to provide education to the tribal children at par with Navodaya school. So the kind of education the Navodaya school children are getting, the tribal children will also get the same quality of education in Eklavya Model Residential School. So that was the
only thing is like, why was there a need for would we not have more Navodaya schools where because if we have like let's say in one district there is a Navodaya school and there is a Eklavya school, so that segregation kind of happens automatically, at least in the perception wise.
Okay. Yeah, you are telling about that education residential school should be inclusive to all the social group.
Since so we already had a model, so,
yes.
I mean, there must be valid reasons.
Okay, so there is not only one reason for this tribal educational deprivation and tribal, that is infrastructure, but there are also other social issues, like as I was telling that tribal representation of scheduled tribe teacher. If the scheduled tribe teacher representation scheduled tribe teacher is less, then definitely there will be discrimination. So tribal children needs a safe space.
Okay. So in Eklavya model schools, the teachers are from the tribal group.
Yeah, from the tribal group, there is not share, but that is a safe space. We can call it a safe space. There, like discrimination will not happen. Like I'm just hypothesizing. So that might be the reason.
I guess the teachers can be anyone, not only the
teachers can be anyone, but
I think there is a different reason probably why we have still Eklavya schools, even though we have Navodaya. See, Navodaya, these are open for all, right? So if you, of course, I think there are also reservations. Now, what happens, like to qualify into the Navodayas, you have to clear the entrance test, right? And so all children probably will not be competent enough to clear that. And moreover, even if say we say that in Odisha 23% children are from tribal community. Now say 23% of the students of Navodaya are from tribal community, but that is also not going to address the problem of the tribal all tribal children. The number of tribal children are much more. Now suppose out of all say 1 crore tribal population, now say 23% could go to this Navodaya. In every district there is only one Navodaya. So all children cannot go to the Navodaya.
So that is there.
There is only one Navodaya in one district. So that means all children cannot go to Navodaya. So where do the other children go? Now they go to all ordinary schools or private schools. Now these have resource problems, right? Usually tribal children suffer from a different kind of problem. Firstly, economic condition, and then natural barriers like geographical distance to the school. Now, Ekalabya Vidyalayas actually provide no solution to all problems faced by the tribal children. Like they are provided no free education, residential facilities, and I think they can come from class 1 probably.
From 6th.
From 6th, okay. So, but there are other no ashram schools probably. They are called. They take actually children even from class 1. Okay, so there are ashrams, sub-ashrams. Now there are different kinds of schools where, so I have to understand. I am still not clear what is sub-ashram and ashram. Probably sub-ashram includes scheduled caste and ashram includes only scheduled tribe. So yeah, I think that could be the reason. So
When did this start? Like
these Ekalabya schools.
1970s.
70s.
So these are
There
like
is
old
no
schools.
eligibility criteria. One has to be tribal to
Yes.
be able to.
Yes.
Right.
On my nice presentation, I'll actually the findings and the methodological approach is okay. I mean, whatever we got in terms of people-teacher issue or the infrastructure availability, these are very common findings in Indian context. If you look at strategy and tribal, but I was looking, improvement in the theoretical debate regarding tribal. If you look at the literature from Odisha and India perspective, like Vishwamepati, Padi and Shodangi and Khakha, they all have done extensive work on this. So 3 major theoretical debate comes out. First is, if you look at the disparity between tribal versus non-tribal groups in Odisha as elsewhere in India, that it has a colonial basis, colonial and pre-colonial basis, because the urban bias of the Britishers led to the concentration of modern education system in the coastal area of Odisha, and which actually led to the availability. I mean, the per head availability is more in coastal area compared to the non-coastal area, which is basically the southwest blocks, tribal dominated, and the gap continues even after independence period. I mean, in the post-colonial period, though the government have taken several initiatives. So the past debate is that the colonial structure, the legacy of the colonial structure is still continuing, and we need to address that. The second debate about this is the governance system. That this kind of literature, they claim that even if there is historical gaps, the government can bridge these gaps through introducing discriminatory policies. Let's say we'll favor tribal people more in terms of education policy and other things. So that includes all the government institutions, which you can tell that's modern institutional hypothesis. And the third, which I got, merging the two, is the agent structure theory. For example, whatever study have been done in this area, they pointed out that one major reason in the constraint of tribal education, on the implementation of policies at the local level, is the caste structure. And caste is a structure which was established by agent long back, and the agent is no more alive, but the structure is continuing. Whoever introduced caste system is no more alive, only the structure continues. Who is continuing the structure is the agent. The upper caste or the historically privileged class, they are maintaining the legacy because they are getting the. So when we are trying to factor out which are the major factors in this gap, is it agent or structure? What needs to be correct first? Should we address the structure or should we address the agents? That is first one. And the second is, do we still believe that the colonial mindset still persists? Should we address that, or it is only government who is responsible for the ongoing disparity? But these are actually the theoretical debates I come across while we are studying some literatures. So I want your remarks on this.
Okay. Thank you for very insightful comments and suggestions. In fact, in my beginning part of slides, I try to address all these problems what you were speaking, or what you told in these three headlines. Particularly, you were talking about the structure, caste structure that is existing, and here I explained about the paternalism of outsider. There is most of the tribal development policies are being framed by the non-tribal communities, and here how, like, because of that, how tribals are being they are being deprived of their rights, and even in the education. And definitely there should be a change of structure, otherwise there will not be improvement. Particularly if we, as I also already explained, the structure, how structure is working in Northeast India and how it is working in Central Indian state. In North Indian state, the most of the structure is mostly dominated by the tribals, but in Central Indian state, the structure is mostly dominated by the non-tribals, particularly dominant caste. And particularly if we see the historical reasons, then soon after the independence, when the states were formed, mostly the tribal kingdoms were divided into many parts and they were distributed into different states, and tribals were made minority in those states. For example, we had Gondwana states, and we had also kingdoms in the Chota Nagpur areas. And now, if you see, the Gondwana state has been divided into Maharashtra. The parts have been divided into Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, even Odisha, and even Chhattisgarh. Now, all the tribals, they have become the minority, and so their representation in the policy making and change in structure is like there is meager, and they are unable to change the structure now. But that need to be changed. But there are constitutional provisions we have, like we have 5th schedule provision, 6th schedule provision that provides self-governance. Tribal can make the rules, and they can decide the policies for their development. But that is unfortunately not happening in India. So we need to be constitutionally more aware, and tribal needs to be they need to be aware about their constitutional rights. So that will lead to the improvement of educational, particularly among the educational progress among tribal, particularly. Yeah. So this is my answer. Yeah. I think I have answered your.
Yeah. So actually, Khaka talk about the constitutional provisions for the
Yes.
recruitment of Adivasi in political and economic institutions. Even he has done extensive study in Odisha, that although there is provision for the Adivasi people to enter into modern institutions like the state bureaucrats or administrative office, but the historical privileged class, they are hostile to the entry of tribal people. And if today you look at the OPS recruitment, I was just doing the analysis, OCS and other. If you compile the data of tribal versus non-tribal districts, the number in the tribal districts is around 20% of the non-tribal districts. So the gap is still persisting. So when we are believing in constitutional rights and government institutions, but these are failing. And I'm asking you why these are failing, even if we have lots of institutional structures, because there is constitutional enforcement. Colonial institutional structure is imposing on these institutions. So we need to address the historical exploitative structures first. If you could not identify those exploitative structures, no matter how much modern policies you implement, that will have still the same impact. And the second thing about whatever Subhankar sir was asking, that do you think that tribal education has a direct link with the reducing exploitation of the tribals? One cross-country study has been done by Watson in 2005 and another by Asimoglu in 2018. They found that it is not education directly protecting the interest of the community or the deprived community. It is indirectly that they found that in wherever tribals are exploited and they are poor, the only one reason is that tribals are fragmented into different groups. That's why the social mobilization is much more weaker compared to the privileged class. They don't have a common narrative to raise voice against the government. So the social mobilization comes from educational awareness. So that is why education can indirectly create social mobilization and which can help to protect the exploitations. I mean, this is the explanation, please.
Okay, fine.
I was wondering, like, in most of your data analysis part, you talked about the kind of comparative study between Chhattisgarh and Odisha. So, but why only Chhattisgarh? Do you see Chhattisgarh as an ideal state?
No, actually, we are doing 5 Indian states, analysis for 5 Indian states, and out of these states, like majorly we are taking here the states who have more tribal concentration, population concentration, and here we find that Chhattisgarh is outperforming the other states. We are not taking Chhattisgarh model as a like good model, but we are taking why Chhattisgarh is performing well, better than the Odisha. So that's the reason we have compared Odisha and Chhattisgarh, and particularly we are trying to do a policy analysis. We are trying to do policy analysis, and we will do what can learn, what Odisha can learn from the Chhattisgarh. So from that perspective, we have taken these 2 states.
Like the way you presented, like to me, it felt like Odisha is want to like reach up to the standard of Chhattisgarh. But it is not only about the tribal education of Odisha or Chhattisgarh, but tribal education in general.
Yes.
So that's why I felt like that. Maybe you are taking it as an ideal state or you took your state.
No, since our focus is on Eastern India, in Eastern India, Chhattisgarh is doing much better.
Is doing better doesn't mean that there is no space for improvement.
No, there is definitely scope for improvement, but even that gap, you see, like they have more tribal population, Odisha also has population, but still Chhattisgarh is doing, and with a similar level of income, right? See, if you go to Northeast, tribal people are not deprived at all, right? They are doing in fact much better. You know why? Because they are in majority. So it is the majority and minority that decides whether you will be deprived or not. Right? If tribal people are in majority, then they are not in disadvantaged position.
So among all the states in India,
You compare
Chhattisgarh
not
is doing like
no, not Chhattisgarh. Chhattisgarh is not doing outstanding. I'm telling you, northeastern part. In northeastern part of India, we have more tribal population, right? So where the tribal population is like the highest, or they are not in minority, they are doing much better. So, but here actually, if you focus only on eastern part of India, then Chhattisgarh is doing better. And we don't consider Bihar and West Bengal here, where the tribal population is much less. So now Odisha and Chhattisgarh have, like you can say, sizable tribal population, but between these two, Chhattisgarh is doing better.
Population wise, Odisha has the most number of tribals in India, right?
Yes. Variety.
I did not know that.
62. And even PVT also we have.
and what about Chhattisgarh?
Chhattisgarh has 29. 43.
Just
Tribes.
number wise, Odisha has
Tribes, number of tribes.
7 PBTs is
Total percentage wise, Odisha
Higher.
is third.
Chhattisgarh
total
has.
percentage in third. First is
Tribal population wise,
That
Chhattisgarh
is
has
among
33.
the within the state only, but all India level.
All India level.
Odisha has the highest number of
Yes,
tribals.
yes.
Yeah.
And Odisha has third highest number of tribals in India. But among the most diversified population within the tribal, Odisha is first.
No, see 9.2, no, Odisha.
Yeah.
Other states are there, na?
Madhya Pradesh is much.
Okay. MP has more.
Yeah,
It's a bigger state, geographically also.
I thought the tribal population came to only this side, eastern side.
Sir, I was also
Yeah,
thinking
Central
that-
Indian states, they are about 80% of the tribal population live. In
Leadership,
Northeast India,
hypothesis.
representation of the scheduled tribe is higher, but in
Number
terms
is-
of absolute number, then
Yeah,
it is very less.
So you talked about
Okay, I think
club school. Like, are there any reservation for the outside candidates, like for the teachers recruitment?
For that is, I think I don't have idea, but I think that whatever the rules recruitment in general, that is being
no,
followed.
okay, I'll come back to you on that. I think one online participant, Himanshu Shekhar Thapa, wants to ask question. Himanshu, you can unmute and ask question.
Yeah. Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah. Yes, you are audible. Yes.
That's a great presentation, Dr. John. So I just have a clarificatory question that there are some other factors which are responsible for this dropout rates in schools because you are particularly trying to look into this representation of tribal students in schools. So one of the major factor I feel is parental involvement, like the role of parents, like how the parents' role is important for improving the enrollment ratio and retention of the students in particular level of schools. And the second thing is the private tuitions. So have you considered these things in your work? Because I cannot see these things in your literature review as well as in your PPTs also. So I just wanted to ask whether you have included those things or not.
Okay. Now we are still analyzing our this issue, and here mostly we have focused on the supply side factor, that is from the government, like or in terms of school infrastructure. But we are also we are also focusing on the various societal issues, like how that perception of the parents that are also leading to tribal education, that is also influencing tribal education. So we are also looking at, but currently we are now focusing on the supply side factors. Now later we will be looking at this issue. We will be also analyzing this issue.
Hi. So one of the suggestions was to increase the proportion of tribal teachers in government schools. So the government Odisha already tried doing that somewhat unsuccessfully. Because for example, there are 1,000 vacancies in Kandhamal district, and it is simply not possible to recruit more than the reservation of tribal teachers, because employment cannot be denied on the basis of location or social category. So how do you think this can be achieved? Or there are some other ways to reduce the social distance between tribal students and uh, teachers from other categories, SCVT and general teachers?
Okay. First of all, like our one of the major suggestion was to government should invest heavily on the infrastructure. If you see, the dropout among the tribal children in the higher secondary education is very high if we compare with the other social group, and that is might be the major reason why we don't have the aspirants to who are aspiring to be teacher. So in order to increase the aspirants or who will be the teachers in the future, the government need to mostly invest in the secondary higher secondary education, because after secondary education, the most of the tribal children are dropping out. Even there are studies which shows that about 80% of the 90% of that student drop out when there is matriculation. So mostly the government need to invest in higher secondary education, and one thing the Chhattisgarh government, I felt I did not fail to explain here, that Chhattisgarh government is doing is that Chhattisgarh government is organizing some skill development program for the tribal, particularly who are in the higher secondary or secondary education, and and Chhattisgarh government is providing them a career guidance, and Odisha can adopt that, and through his more number of students in the higher secondary education can increase, and that will lead to the higher number of, that will increase the higher number of scheduled type teacher in Odisha. So that can be solution. Thank you. I think I have answered your question.
Yes, yes.
Now, Mr. if I also try to respond to your question, I think this is supply side issue, and of course, John has already replied that we don't have sufficient tribal children who have completed, say, 12th standard and city training, and who have cleared OTET. And if we try to increase that number, then automatically you will have more applications. In fact, if you, since you have done studies on education, you might be aware that lot of tribal people were appointed in schools, primary schools, without having any formal training, no teachers training program. And the reason was that the state did not have enough tribal teachers who have got the training. So we have to relax the norms for the tribal community to fill up those vacancies. Okay, so if government wants to say recruit some more tribal children or tribal people, that can be done. And one more also issue actually I will try to tell you. Say these coastal belt people are very clever, right? They know that if they apply in the coastal districts, they will not get a job here because the cutoffs are very high. And what they do, they apply for the backward districts, so that the cutoff is lower there and they get a job there. And once they get the job there, and then that becomes permanent after 6 years, then they try to come back to the coastal district. So in such cases, my concern, and we have seen that pupil-teacher ratio in the tribal districts are quite high. So my concern will be that, or even in fact, in a blog in Ajahn Premji University's Practitioners Connect, we had pointed this out, and we have pointed out that if such people opt to remain in those tribal districts, there should be no transfer for them. Rather, they should be trained in the tribal languages that you are willing to teach to the tribal community, tribal children. So you learn their language and teach them in their language. That mother tongue based multilingual education. Because we observed that mother tongue based multilingual education is not successful because you don't have sufficient teachers from their community who can speak. But a teacher has opted to go to that district and teach to the tribal children. Now these teachers should be trained actually in that language. So then the supply side problem is addressed, right? So I think we have to think actually out of box, and so that way, Lakshman's concern will be still valid, that the state machinery is not willing, and this is again our policies are biased actually towards certain communities. We don't want to actually give a favorable consideration to the tribal communities. Does that answer, Biswajit?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's what I was also thinking.
Yeah. In fact, no, we in a blog actually in Ajahn University Practitioners Connect, Santakumar sir and I actually were talking about the Brazilian model. In Brazil also, the tribal community did not, or the indigenous groups did not have sufficient teachers, and that's why the tribal education was, the indigenous community's education was really bad. So what Brazil did, Brazil gave the right of appointing teachers to the local government, like say here at Panchayat. Okay, now Panchayat will decide whether they have sufficient. And in fact, for all your information, as per the 73rd constitutional amendment, education is a subject of Panchayat Raj institution, not even the Jilla Parishad. Sarpanch should appoint the teachers. Sarpanch should approve the salary of the teacher as per the 73rd constitutional amendment, right? So if that is there in the constitution, of course, unfortunately, Odisha has not transferred that power till date, and there are also valid reasons, or in that we don't know actually whether those are valid or invalid.
Has any other state done it?
No, no one has done it. Okay. So, but it is there in the constitution. The constitution says that you should transfer this power to the panchayat. So now Brazil is now observing that whether our local school has sufficient teachers from the indigenous community or not. Now, in a panchayat where indigenous community people are more, you have to appoint teachers from indigenous community. And if that is not there, then the panchayat gives special training to an indigenous person and appoints. So it might be actually contractual or anything, but the panchayat appoints. He gives special training and appoints that. So then that problem can be addressed. And so in our article in that blog, actually we have suggested two things. Either you do this one, that you give right to the panchayat to recruit people from their own community in their own village school, or the teachers who have chosen to go to that region should be trained in the mother tongue, their mother tongue. Okay? In any case, actually problem can be addressed, but government is not doing anything, right?
That Brazilian model, I think, like instead of like addressing this discrimination, it will make more discrimination.
It will not go, no, not at all.
Because like how qualified is this Panchayat people in India?
So you are telling how qualified or not? How
And they will definitely choose the people who are
No.
close to them.
how qualified our MLAs? How qualified our chief ministers?
That
We
is
have
also
never
like the
questioned
same
about
thing.
that.
I'm
A
questioning on
person who is
Panchayat.
completely illiterate can become chief minister, right?
Yes.
You never question that, but you question only the serpents. So these
No,
are
I'm
actually-
just taking just
No,
one
I understand your
instance.
concern, but no, it is not like that actually, right? We have all the fears. No, there is a power relation we try to maintain. Okay? We never question actually the chief minister's qualification, but why do you question the qualification of a serpent? If constitution is saying this, you better do this.
That's why I'm saying that model, like if you apply this model, like while addressing one problem, you will have to fetch 100 more.
Not really. We don't know actually, right? We don't know. Who tells that actually? If
The
you give
second
power
one,
to
I
the
find it
panchayat,
very useful, like teaching the like
yeah, the
people
teachers who have gone there,
for their native
yeah,
language.
you make it mandatory that you have chosen, say this block and this school, so you have to learn the language of the local people. Otherwise, you cannot be appointed here. Okay, so as similar. Then many people will be, probably no. I think they can learn the language. It's not very difficult to learn a language. Okay? And see, look at the collectors.
Yeah, I will
They have to know if you are appointed in Odisha category, you have to learn Odia within 6 months. So same thing is you do for the teachers. Problem can be, so, but we don't do that. But you are telling something else. I disturbed you.
Just wanted to know like whether there is any reservation for the outside recruitment for teachers in a model of school.
That part I don't know.
So I have also no idea.
Yeah,
State
how
board
the
members-
recruitment
It
happens.
is only for the tribal. Yeah, but for the teachers, like anybody can apply, but how much?
Biswajit, you want to say something on this Eklavya schools?
Eklavya school recruitments are no different from other school recruitments. Anybody can apply, and according to the constitutional reservations, they get appointed.
Oh,
So they are not all tribal teachers.
so if there are no questions, then we should thank John for making a very good presentation.